a maintenance worker, a billionaire CEO, a flash drive that could destroy them both. At midnight, Ronan Beckett pulled a terrified woman from three armed men in an underground parking garage not because he was brave, but because he couldn't make himself look away. He didn't know who she was. She didn't know what he used to be, but someone was already watching. By sunrise, they knew his name, his address, and the one thing they could use against him: his 9-year-old daughter and the 120 families who called the building he fixed every day home. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, underestimated, written off, this story was made for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will surprise you in ways you won't see coming. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your city and country in the comments. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we put out next, and tap the like if you're already in. Now let's begin. The shift ended at 11:48 p.m., same as it always did when nothing broke late. Ronan Beckett clocked out at the maintenance office on the ground floor of Westbridge Towers, signed the log with the pen that never worked on the first try, and stood for a moment in the doorway, listening to the building settle around him. Old buildings talk to themselves at night, Westbridge especially. The heating system knocked through the pipes in the east wing. The freight elevator cable groaned when the temperature dropped. The third-floor corridor had a soft spot near apartment 312 that flexed underfoot like a held breath. Ronan knew every sound this building made. He'd been listening to it for 4 years. He pulled on his jacket, dark canvas, worn at both elbows, and walked to the parking level to retrieve his truck. His daughter Sadie was at the neighbor's apartment across the hall, asleep by now on Mrs. Dela Cruz's couch with the television still on, the way she always fell asleep when he worked late. He'd carry her home, and she'd wake up just enough to say something nonsensical, something about school or a dream or a song she'd heard, and then be out again before her head touched the pillow. That was the part of the day Ronan looked forward to most. He was 37 years old. He had a truck with 140,000 miles on it, a maintenance worker's salary, and a 9-year-old daughter who still believed the world was essentially fair. He intended to protect at least one of those things for as long as he possibly could. Parking garage at the Harwick Hotel was 2 blocks from Westbridge, connected by a pedestrian underpass that made the walk home marginally shorter on cold nights. Ronan used it most evenings in winter. He knew the garage attendant, an older man named Gus, who read paperback westerns and didn't say much. Gus wasn't at his booth tonight. The arm gate was raised. The overhead lighting on the lower level was flickering in that particular way that meant a ballast was going, not just a bulb. Ronan noticed these things automatically. He couldn't help it. It was the way his brain was wired after years of training that he no longer talked about. He heard them before he saw them. Not loud. That was what caught his attention first, the careful quietness of it. 3 men, and they were being deliberate about how much sound they made. One of them said something low and flat. A woman's voice answered, and there was something stripped out of it. The particular sound a voice makes when a person is trying to stay calm and not succeeding. Ronan slowed without stopping. He moved naturally, the way he'd been trained to move when he needed to see without being seen seeing. A black SUV was positioned at an angle that blocked a smaller vehicle from backing out of its space. Not accidental. The angle was too precise, the placement too considered. One of the 3 men stood at the far end of the row near the exit ramp, facing outward. Another was near the stairwell door. The third was close to the woman, within arm's reach. She was young, late 20s, maybe 30. Dark coat, good shoes, the kind of handbag that cost more than Ronan's monthly rent. She was holding it against her chest with both arms, and the man nearest to her was talking in a tone that was almost conversational, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. Ronan assessed what he was looking at. This was not a random robbery. Random robberies were desperate and fast and loud. This was controlled. The exit coverage, the camera angles the man near the stairwells, was positioned directly beneath the overhead security camera, which meant he wasn't avoiding it, he was blocking it. Someone had thought about sightlines. Someone had done a walkthrough of this space before tonight. These men were professionals, or close enough to it to be dangerous. The nearest man reached out and grabbed the handbag by the strap. She pulled back. "No, wait, let go," he said. Still that same flat tone. "Don't make this harder." Ronan was already moving not toward them, but toward the electrical panel on the near wall, a gray metal box he'd noticed on a dozen previous walks through this garage the kind of secondary panel that fed the lower-level lighting circuit. He'd looked at it the way he looked at all electrical panels, the way most people looked at wallpaper without meaning to, without being able to stop himself. He pulled the panel open and threw the main breaker. The lower level went black in an instant, and in the same motion, Ronan found the emergency alarm pull station by feel he'd seen it on the wall 6 feet from the panel and yanked it. The alarm tore through the garage like something being split open. Red emergency strobes kicked on at the stairwell exits, intermittent and disorienting. Through the noise and flashing light, Ronan heard the 3 men react a sharp curse, the sound of movement, a voice giving a sharp instruction that got swallowed by the alarm. He was already at the maintenance passage door on the near wall, the kind of unmarked door that exists in every parking structure, and that almost nobody who isn't paid to know about it ever notices. He hit the handle and pushed through. "Hey!" He said it directly at the woman, who had spun toward the sound of the alarm and was standing still the way people stand still when they can't process what's happening fast enough to move. "Through here now." She looked at him. He could see her face in the red strobe, flicker wide-eyed, trying to decide if he was another threat. "The exit ramp," he said. "They're covering it. This is the other way out." One of the men shouted something behind her. That made the decision for her. She came through the door. Ronan pulled it shut behind them and hit the crash bar on the access panel. To his left, a gate release he'd seen on the building schematic posted inside the panel, the kind of thing maintenance workers noticed and nobody else did. Through the wall, he heard the mechanical clunk of the security gate, dropping across the exit ramp. The stairwell they were in was plain concrete and humming fluorescent light, smelling like exhaust and old mop water. The woman was breathing hard, her back against the wall, the handbag now clutched with both arms again. "Who are you?" she said. Somebody who walked through at the wrong time. He moved past her toward the stairwell exit. "Come on." Up 1 level, then out the side door to the street. She told him her name was Natalie. She said it the way people say a name when they're leaving out everything attached to it, and Ronan didn't push. He'd given his own first name and nothing else. They were even. He walked her to the corner of Harwick and 5th, where the streetlights were working and there were other people around. A couple walking a dog, a man closing up a food cart. The normal texture of a city at midnight that wasn't aware anything had just happened. She was steadier on her feet now, though her hands weren't quite still. There were 3 of them, she said. It wasn't directed at him so much as said aloud, like she was trying to make it real and concrete. "I know. The one at the ramp was there to cut off your route to the street. The one at the stairwell was blocking the camera feed. The one close to you." He stopped. "You understand what I'm saying?" She looked at him. "That it wasn't random." "No," he said. "It wasn't random." She was quiet for a moment. Then they wanted the bag specifically. He kept saying, "Just give it to me," like he already knew what was in it. She paused. "Which doesn't make sense. I don't carry anything in here except the usual: my wallet, my phone, a notebook." "Check it," Ronan said. She opened the bag under the streetlight, going through it the way a person goes through. A bag they know well, efficient, familiar. Stopped. "This isn't mine." She pulled out a small object, flat and rectangular, the kind of thing you could hold between 2 fingers. A flash drive. Black casing, no label, nothing written on it. "I've never seen this before." Ronan looked at it without touching it. "Don't plug that into anything." "I wasn't going to." Don't plug it into anything tonight," he said. "Not your laptop, not your phone adapter. Nothing. Not until you know what it is and how it got there." She looked at him with a slightly different expression than she'd been wearing for the last 10 minutes, less shock, more assessment. "You know about things like that." It wasn't quite a question. "I know enough," he said. She offered him money. He was aware that it was a significant amount by the way she said it, certain, specific, the way wealthy people name numbers they're accustomed to spending. He turned it down without thinking about it. "You don't want anything?" "I want to get home and check on my daughter," he said. "That's what I want." Something shifted in her face. "You have a daughter, 9 years old, probably dreaming about horses or whatever it is this week." He took a half step back, the gesture of a conversation ending. "Keep that drive somewhere, separate from your bag. And maybe don't use the Harwick garage for a while." She laughed, short and genuine, the first real sound she'd made that wasn't tension. "Sound advice." "I'm full of sound advice," he said. "Ask anyone at the building where I work." He left her on the corner with 2 other people nearby and the dog-walking couple still visible down the block, because he wasn't going to leave her truly alone, and she could tell the difference. He'd made sure of that. He walked home. Westbridge Towers stood at the intersection of Crail Street and Marginal Avenue, 11 stories of 1970s concrete that had seen better decades. Ronan had lived in apartment 4C for 4 years, which made him one of the longer-tenured residents. The building had 120 units at capacity, though several were empty now, not because people wanted to leave, but because Vanguard Crest Group, the property management corporation that owned Westbridge, had a habit of letting vacant apartments stay vacant, and occupied ones drift toward a standard of maintenance that kept people uncomfortable enough to consider leaving on their own. Ronan had been watching this happen slowly for 2 years. He'd filed maintenance requests that went unanswered. He'd flagged the elevator certification lapses and the corroded plumbing in the east wing and the basement electrical panels that were running past their service life. He'd done it through proper channels, written and documented, because he'd learned in a previous life that documentation was the difference between a problem you could prove and a problem someone could pretend didn't exist. His requests were logged, occasionally acknowledged, never acted on. 3 weeks ago, Vanguard Crest had circulated a notice to residents suggesting that the building was under review for structural integrity and that residents should prepare for the possibility of relocation. It was phrased in the careful, non-specific language of corporate communications, which meant it could mean almost anything or nothing, and which produced in the residents exactly the anxiety it was designed to produce. Mrs. Dela Cruz, who'd lived in 4D for 19 years and was 71 and moved with a cane since her hip surgery, had asked Ronan what the notice meant. He'd told her he didn't know yet, but he was working on finding out. She'd looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, like she wanted to believe him and was trying to decide if she could afford to. He'd told her again he was working on it. He carried Sadie home at 12:30. She woke up just long enough to say something about a fish she'd seen in a book at school, something about how it was blue, and also had a name, and then she was out again. Face pressed into his shoulder, one hand loosely gripping his collar. He settled her into bed, turned off her light, and stood in the doorway for a moment. The building hummed around them. The heating pipe knocked in the wall behind her dresser. Somewhere below, the freight elevator groaned on its cable. He went to bed and lay there in the dark, and the image he kept coming back to was not the 3 men in the garage, or the woman's face in the strobe light. It was the flash drive. Small, black, featureless. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. He'd been in enough situations to know that objects that weren't supposed to be somewhere usually explained why other things that weren't supposed to happen were about to happen. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself that twice. Then he turned off the light and eventually slept, and in the morning everything changed anyway. He was in the building's basement at 740 A.M., replacing a section of corroded pipe in the utility corridor, when he heard the sound of vehicles outside, not one, more than one, and the particular engine note of something expensive moving slowly. Came up the service stairs and pushed through the side door to the front of the building. 3 vehicles. Black, clean, the kind of SUVs that got detailed every week regardless of whether they needed it. They had stopped at the curb in front of Westbridge Towers, with the practiced precision of a convoy, accustomed to arriving at places that mattered. The lead vehicle's door opened. Ronan stood on the steps with a length of pipe in one hand and watched Natalie walk toward him across the sidewalk. She was dressed differently than she had been the night before, not better, exactly, just completely different, a different version of the same person. She wore a dark blazer and moved with a kind of contained certainty that he recognized now in a way he hadn't fully registered at midnight under a streetlight. Behind her, 2 men in the kind of suits that were explicitly not fashion statements flanked her at a careful distance. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. To her credit, she didn't flinch, though her step changed slightly, a microscopic adjustment of pace, the kind of thing most people would miss. Ronan didn't move from the step. "You live here," she said when she was close enough to say it. "I work here," he said. "I also live here. I own here." She said it not like a boast, but like someone's setting out a fact that was going to be uncomfortable for both of them. Natalie Ashbourne, CEO, Vanguard Crest Group. The pipe in Ronan's hand suddenly felt like a different object than it had 30 seconds ago. He looked at her, then at the vehicles at the curb, then back at her. "You're my landlord," he said. "Technically, yes. And you were in a parking garage at midnight getting mugged." "Technically," she said. "I was in a meeting that ran long, and someone knew my route home." He stepped back from the door to let her through. Not because he was comfortable with it, but because she was going to come in regardless, and standing in the doorway with a pipe wasn't a statement, it was just inconvenient. "You want to tell me what's on that drive," he said. "I want to tell you everything," she said, "and I need you to understand that I didn't know any of it until this morning." Ronan held the door. His shift technically started at 8. The corroded pipe section in the basement was still sitting in the utility corridor where he'd left it. Upstairs, Sadie was eating cereal in the apartment and watching 15 minutes of television before school, which was the deal they'd worked out for mornings when he had early jobs. He thought about the relocation notice. He thought about Mrs. Delacruz's face. "All right," he said. "Tell me, Natalie Ashbourne didn't look like someone who was used to sitting in maintenance offices." She sat across from Ronan at the small folding table he used for paperwork, in a chair with one leg slightly shorter than the others that made it rock almost imperceptibly every time she shifted her weight. She'd noticed it within the first 30 seconds and said nothing about it, which told him something. One of her security men had posted himself outside the door without being asked. The other had stayed with the vehicles. She'd told them both to give her the room, and they'd complied in the way people comply when they're not quite comfortable with the instruction, but they're more uncomfortable with arguing about it. The flash drive was on the table between them. She hadn't touched it since placing it there. "What I'm about to tell you," she said, "I found out this morning. Most of it in the car on the way here." "Most of it," Ronan said. Caught the emphasis. "I'll come back to the parts I knew." He'd poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corner, the kind of machine that produced something hot and brown that approximated coffee without ever fully committing to the description. He pushed one across the table to her. She didn't touch it either, but she didn't move it away. "There's an internal auditor at Vanguard," she said. "His name is Miles Corwin. He's been with the company 9 years, works in compliance, the kind of person most of the executive team couldn't pick out of a lineup because he never comes to anything with catering." She paused. 3 weeks ago, Miles filed an internal report flagging irregularities in our redevelopment pipeline. Properties that were being assessed for structural concerns with unusual speed. Maintenance budgets that had been drawn down to levels that couldn't be explained by normal operational decisions. "Properties like this one," Ronan said. "Properties exactly like this one." She looked at the table, not at him. "The report went to our chief operating officer, Conrad Voss. He's been with Vanguard for 11 years, runs the operational side of everything property management, redevelopment, capital allocation. He's very good at his job." She stopped again. He was very good at suppressing that report too. Miles never heard anything back. When he tried to follow up through official channels, he found that the version of his report in the system had been substantially altered. The irregularities he'd flagged were either reclassified or deleted. Ronan watched her face. She wasn't performing distress. She was reporting facts and experiencing them at the same time, and the experience was visibly unpleasant. "So Miles made a copy," he said. "Miles made several copies. Physical documents he kept off the network. And when he realized the report had been buried, he started compiling additional evidence. Financial transfers, shell company registrations, communications he wasn't supposed to have seen." She finally looked up. And then, approximately 10 days ago, Miles Corwin disappeared from his apartment and stopped coming to work. Conrad's office filed a missing persons inquiry that went precisely nowhere because Conrad's office wrote it. And the drive. Miles was at a Vanguard event 6 days ago. Quarterly investor gathering. I attended the last hour. Apparently he was there too, not on the guest list. Came in through a staff entrance, which means someone let him in. She glanced at the flash drive. "I don't know when he put it in my bag. I don't know which room or how he got close enough. But Miles knew that bag was mine. I've carried it to events for 2 years. And he knew Conrad's people were watching him, which means he needed to pass the evidence to someone they wouldn't expect to be carrying it. He chose you. He chose me," she said, "and Conrad's people were already watching me closely enough to know it." Ronan sat back, the chair creaked. Outside the office, he could hear the building's morning sounds residents heading out, footsteps in the corridor above Mrs. Delacruz's television leaking through the floor from her apartment 1 level up, the morning news at a volume set for ears that didn't quite catch everything anymore. "What exactly does the drive contain?" he said. "A financial map," she said. "Transfers routed through a series of holding companies, none of them traceable to Vanguard at first look, all of them traceable to Conrad at the second. Properties acquired through those companies, always after Vanguard had classified the original buildings as structurally compromised. Pattern is," she stopped herself. It's not complicated once you see it. Conrad identifies a property with redevelopment value. He engineers a deterioration timeline by restricting maintenance budgets. When the building is condemned or evacuated, the land value adjusts. Then his shell companies move in at the reduced rate and hold the land until redevelopment rights increase the value again. And the residents, Ronan said, are displaced, she said. Yes, not displaced. He said it without heat but firmly. Mrs. Delacruz has lived in 4D for 19 years. The Cautry family in 7B has 3 kids in school 2 blocks from here. Martin Osees in 9A is 74 years old and takes the elevator because his knees don't manage stairs anymore. When you displace people like that, you're not relocating an asset. You're ending something that took decades to build and can't be rebuilt somewhere else. Natalie held his gaze. I know, do you? I'm starting to, she said, and the honesty in it was the kind that cost something to say, which was different from the kind that was easy. Ronan picked up the flash drive and turned it over once, then set it back down. You said there were parts you knew. She didn't look away. I approved maintenance budget reductions for Westbridge and 11 other properties over the past 3 years. Conrad brought them to me as operational efficiency measures. I reviewed the numbers. I signed off. Without coming here. Without coming here, she said. Without meeting anyone who lived here. I looked at percentage figures in a quarterly report and I said yes. She picked up the coffee cup, then set it down without drinking from it. I didn't know what Conrad was doing with those reductions, but I signed them. My signature is on them. The room was quiet except for the building around them. Why are you telling me that part? He said. Because you're going to find out anyway. And because I need you to understand who I actually am before I ask you to trust me. Ronan thought about that for a moment. Then he said, What do you need from me? I don't know yet, she said. But you live here. You know this building. Last night you assessed a threat situation in approximately 4 seconds and got me out through a door I didn't know existed. She paused. Who are you exactly? A maintenance worker, he said. She waited. Who used to do something else, he said. She waited some more. He picked up his coffee. Let's look at what's on the drive first. The drive opened onto a folder structure that Miles Corwin had organized with the systematic precision of someone who'd spent 9 years in compliance and understood that if this ever had to be presented to anyone, clarity would be survival. Ronan read through it on the maintenance office laptop Ancient, fan loud, running an operating system 2 updates behind while Natalie stood at his shoulder, and both of them were quiet for a long time. The financial architecture was exactly what she'd described, but seeing it laid out was different from hearing it described. Conrad Voss had built something careful. The shell companies were layered, each one buffered from the next, by a holding entity that existed only on paper, incorporated in one of 3 states known for their friendly attitude toward corporate anonymity. The money moved in amounts that individually stayed under the thresholds that triggered automatic compliance flags. Timing of each property acquisition followed the building assessment by between 60 and 90 days, long enough to look coincidental, step short enough that the land value hadn't recovered. Patient. It was methodical, and it had been running for at least 4 years. 11 properties, Ronan said, reading. How many of those buildings were evacuated? 7, Natalie said. The other 4 are still occupied. Westbridge is one of them. Because of the timeline here, he scrolled to a specific document, a projected assessment schedule. Westbridge is set for structural condemnation review in 6 weeks, which would trigger mandatory evacuation, she said. Except he stopped at a file he'd almost passed. He opened it fully and read it twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. Then he sat back. There's an engineering report in here, filed to the Municipal Planning Office 3 weeks ago. It declares Westbridge structurally unsound. It cites specific failure points in the foundation and load-bearing elements. He turned the screen toward her. It's signed by a licensed structural engineer named R. Beckett. Natalie looked at the screen. That's your name. That's my signature, he said. Except I've never filed an engineering report in my life. I'm not a licensed structural engineer. I don't have those credentials. Someone found my name in the building's maintenance records and used it. They forged your signature on a municipal document. On a municipal document that, if it stands, gives the city grounds to order evacuation of 120 families in 30 days or less. The room shifted slightly in both their senses, not the building, not a sound, but the particular quality of air in a space when a situation becomes more serious than it was 30 seconds ago. That's a crime, Natalie said. That's several crimes, Ronan said. And it's also why Conrad's people wanted the drive badly enough to grab you in a parking garage. Because this, he gestured at the screen. This connects everything to him. The shell companies, the evacuation timeline, the forged document. Without this, Conrad's operation is invisible. With it, it's a blueprint. He closed the folder and was about to close the drive entirely when the fire alarm took the building apart. It didn't start gradually the way fire alarms sometimes do, with a test pulse or a hesitant first shriek. It hit at full volume all at once, and Ronan was already out of the chair before the second beat of it sounded. He was at the door before Natalie could stand up. "Stay here." Stay here and call the fire department from your phone, not the building line." He pulled open the door. "Tell them the address and tell them to bring the full response, not a single unit." He went up the stairs at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was faster than anyone else in the building, moved under normal circumstances, hitting each landing and reading the air smell, humidity, temperature differential. First floor, nothing obvious. Ground floor exit corridor, nothing. He pushed through to the basement stairwell and caught it immediately, the particular bite of electrical burn. Hot insulation and scorched wiring, and beneath that, the sharper smell of something accelerated. The basement utility room door was warm at the handle. Not red hot, not dangerously so, but warm enough to mean whatever was happening on the other side was real and had been going on for more than a few minutes. He opened it low and fast the way he'd been trained, keeping his face away from the initial draft. The electrical control cabinet on the east wall was on fire. Not dramatically, not flames climbing the walls, not the movie version. It was an interior burn, contained to the cabinet itself, but the cabinet fed the main building circuits, and whatever had been done to it had overloaded the primary panel in a way that was already cascading through the secondary systems. The smell of the insulation burning was thick and chemical. Two of the main breakers had tripped, and one had welded itself in the on position, which meant that corridor wasn't safe and wouldn't be until the whole circuit was isolated. Ronan grabbed the dry chemical extinguisher from the wall bracket and killed the cabinet fire in 40 seconds. Then he went to the main disconnect and did what should have been done immediately, pulled everything off the eastern building circuit. The lights in the basement went out, and the emergency strips kicked on battery-fed, independent, and he could hear the knock-on effect moving through the building above him as the power died in the east wing. He heard voices upstairs. More voices. The alarm was still going. He went up. The next 20 minutes were not orderly. Ronan knew every exit in Westbridge Towers. He knew which stairwells were wide enough for two people side by side, and which narrowed at the 6th floor landing due to a structural modification in the 1990s. He knew that the residents in the east wing, the side now, without power, included 4 elderly individuals who were not going to move quickly, and he knew that the primary stairwell for that wing had a lighting issue on the 9th floor segment that had been on his maintenance request list for 3 weeks without resolution. He also knew that Martin Ossie in 9A was 74 years old, with knees that didn't cooperate with stairs. He went to 9A first. Martin was in his doorway when Ronan reached the 9th floor. Already dressed retired men, who had spent their working lives in demanding jobs, tended to dress early and was trying to figure out which direction to move. Stairwell light on this floor was out, as Ronan had known it would be, and the emergency strip at the landing was functioning, but casting the kind of thin, directional light that was useless for someone trying to navigate unfamiliar darkness. "I've got you," Ronan said. "Stay with me." "I can manage the stairs," Martin said, because 74-year-old men who'd managed everything themselves for decades said things like that even when they weren't entirely sure it was true. "I know you can," Ronan said, "but we're going faster than the stairs allow tonight. Come here." He got Martin's arm across his shoulders, and they went down together, Ronan taking the weight differential on the turns and talking Martin through each landing in a steady, even voice, not urgent, not falsely calm, just accurate. 876. The stairwell filled with other residents as they descended, families with children, a young couple carrying a cat in a cardboard box with holes punched in the top, the woman from 5B who'd told Ronan 3 times this week that the heating in her unit was insufficient and was now wearing 3 sweaters and still managing to be faster on the stairs than most people half her age. 5th floor. 4th. Ronan handed Martin off to another resident at the 3rd floor landing and doubled back up because he'd heard, from somewhere on the 2nd floor east corridor, an older woman's voice calling out. Mrs. Dela Cruz was standing in her doorway, holding her cane in one hand and a small plastic bag of what appeared to be important documents in the other. because 19 years in a building taught you which things to grab. Corridor behind her was thick with the residue smoke that had worked its way up from the basement through the ventilation, not dangerous at this level, but enough to make the air taste wrong and visibility difficult past 20 feet. I was waiting for you, she said when she saw Ronan. I know, he said. I'm here. Is it bad? Basement electrical. It's out now. We just need to get everyone outside. She took his arm, and they moved down the corridor toward the stairwell. And they were 8 feet from the stairwell door when the secondary electrical failure happened, not a fire. Just a cascade fault in the circuit Ronan hadn't fully isolated. Power surge that blew the remaining emergency strips in the east corridor and left the hallway genuinely dark. Ronan pulled his phone from his pocket with his free hand and turned on the flashlight without breaking stride. They made the stairwell door. They went down. They came out into the cold morning air in front of the building, where residents were gathering in clusters on the sidewalk in various states of dress, some holding children, some just standing and looking up at the building, with the particular expression of people trying to assess how bad something is by looking at it from the outside. Counted. He moved through the groups, counting. He tracked against his mental map of occupied units. Came up short by 2 people on the 7th floor. He went back in. The young couple from 7F had been waiting on their floor because the woman was 8 months pregnant and had decided on her own authority that descending 8 flights of stairs without assistance was inadvisable, which was a rational decision that Ronan supported entirely and also had to override immediately. He got them down in the time it took, which was longer than he would have liked and shorter than it could have been. When they came out the front door, the fire department had arrived 2 units, which was what you got when a resident with a good phone and apparently specific instructions called in a full response. And paramedics were assessing the small number of people who'd come out coughing. Ronan stood on the front steps and looked at his building. Fire was out. He knew that because he'd put it out himself. The electrical damage was real and would take time and money to repair, but the structure was sound. He knew that too because he'd been inside every wall of this building at least once, and the foundation issues cited in the forged engineering report didn't exist. He'd seen the actual foundation. He knew what it looked like. Someone had overloaded that electrical cabinet deliberately. He hadn't had time to examine it carefully, but he'd seen enough in 40 seconds of extinguisher work to know the failure pattern was wrong for a natural fault. The breakers had been bypassed in a specific way that wasn't age-related deterioration. You had to know what you were doing to create that kind of failure, and you had to have access to the basement utility room, which meant a key, or someone who'd watched which one to copy. He felt Natalie at his shoulder before he heard her. "Everyone out," she said. "Everyone out." She was quiet for a moment, watching the paramedics, watching the residents on the sidewalk. Sadie appeared from somewhere in the crowd. She'd been at school for an hour already, so she wasn't here. Ronan remembered, and then caught himself. Sadie was at school. She was fine. She was fine, and in the gap of that brief disorientation, Natalie said something that took him a moment to process. It was deliberate, she said. "Yes, Conrad's people. Whoever has access to a maintenance master key and knows which cabinet feeds which circuit," he said. "That's not a random vandalism job. That's someone who did their homework." She put her arms across her chest, not a cold gesture, a held-in one. "They're not trying to build a case for evacuation anymore." "No," Ronan said. "They're trying to manufacture one." He watched Martinosi accept a blanket from a paramedic on the sidewalk. He watched the young couple from 7F sit down on the building's front steps, the woman's hand on her stomach. He watched Mrs. Dela Cruz, still holding her bag of documents, talking to the woman from 5B with the 3 sweaters. 120 families. Some of them had been here longer than Ronan had been alive. Some had moved in last year. None of them had signed up for this. None of them knew that the company that owned their building had a chief operating officer who decided their homes were worth more as vacant land. "What do you want to do?" Natalie said. Ronan kept looking at the building. The fire department had gone inside to run their assessment. The residents on the sidewalk were doing what people do when something frightening has just happened and appears to be over. They were starting to talk to each other, comparing what they'd heard and seen, the specific animated relief of people who've come through something, and are discovering that everyone else came through it too. "I want to look at the maintenance logs from the basement utility room for the last 2 weeks, he said. "I want to know who's been in there besides me. And if we find something," he looked at her. Then we're going to have a conversation about what kind of company you're running and what you're going to do about it. Natalie didn't flinch. Fair enough, she said. The cold morning settled around them. The building stood. And inside Ronan, something that had been professionally dormant for 4 years was awake again. Paying attention, already working through the geometry of a problem that was no longer just about pipes and permits and unanswered maintenance requests. Someone had come after this building with the people still inside it. That changed what this was. The maintenance logs told a story that Ronan read the way he'd been trained to read terrain, not looking for the obvious thing, but for what was absent. The basement utility room had a paper sign-in sheet mounted inside the door, a system so old and low-tech that it had survived every corporate efficiency review Vanguard had run on the building, simply because nobody in those reviews had thought about it. Ronan had started the log himself 2 years ago. After the third time, he'd found the room in a different state than he'd left it. It wasn't official policy. It was just a sheet of paper on a clipboard that said Date Name Pure at the top. And most of the people who used the room, which was primarily Ronan, and occasionally the contracted elevator technician, signed it without thinking about it, because a clipboard on a wall was the kind of authority that most people didn't question. The last 2 weeks showed 7 entries in Ronan's handwriting and one in a hand he didn't recognize. 4 days ago. No name, just a single initial. Purpose listed as routine inspection. Time in, 9:15 a.m. Time out, blank. They didn't sign out, Natalie said, reading over his shoulder. Nobody forgets to sign out of a routine inspection, Ronan said. You forget to sign out when leaving quickly was more important than the paperwork. He photographed the log sheet with his phone. Then he photographed the electrical cabinet from 3 angles, capturing the bypass configuration he'd seen during the fire suppression, the specific, deliberate arrangement of the panel components that didn't happen through age or accident or ordinary electrical fault. He sent both sets of photographs to his own email and then to a second address, a precaution he'd developed years ago in a context where redundancy was the difference between a record existing and a record disappearing. Natalie watched him do this without commenting. She was learning, he noticed, to read what he was doing without needing it explained. That was either intelligence or trust or both, and he wasn't sure yet which one it was. The fire department had cleared the building as safe for re-entry. The electrical damage to the east wing was real. That corridor would need rewiring before it could be brought back online, but the rest of the building was functioning. The structural integrity was untouched, and the basement fire had been contained to the cabinet itself without spreading. The department's incident report would reflect an electrical fault. It would not reflect what Ronan knew the fault actually was, because the distinction between a failure and a deliberate failure was not something a standard fire assessment was designed to detect. Conrad Voss would read that report and know his people had done their job. That was the part that bothered Ronan most as he stood in the basement with Natalie and thought through the geometry of what they were dealing with. Conrad already knew the fire had happened. He'd know the building was still standing. He'd also know the drive hadn't been recovered if it had. The pressure on Natalie would have stopped after the garage, which meant Conrad would be assessing his next move, and the move after the garage and the fire was going to be more direct. You need to understand something, Ronan said. He turned from the cabinet and faced her directly. You were going to go to the board this morning. Tell me you weren't. She had the expression of someone caught doing something predictable. It's the appropriate channel. It's the channel Conrad controls, he said. Not completely, maybe, but enough. Someone told those men in the garage exactly where you'd be and what route you'd take home. Someone erased the garage camera footage before the police request went in. I checked this morning. The hotel confirmed the footage for that time frame is gone. Someone had access to this building's basement with a master key and knew which cabinet to sabotage. He paused. All of that requires information that lives inside Vanguard's systems. Conrad has people inside your security network. If you walk into a board meeting this morning with that drive, you're walking through the door he's expecting you to walk through. Quiet for a moment. Her expression moved through several things: resistance, consideration, something that looked like the particular frustration of a person who was used to being the one who set the terms of a situation and was being asked to recognize that she wasn't right now. So what do you suggest? She said. I suggest, he said, that we don't go anywhere Conrad can predict. And I suggest you understand who you're working with before you decide how much to trust me. She looked at him steadily. I'm listening, he told her. He didn't dress it up. That wasn't the way he'd been trained, and it wasn't his nature. He told her he'd served 12 years in the Navy, the last 8 with SEAL Team 8, operating primarily in environments where the infrastructure of normal safety didn't exist, and where the ability to read a situation faster than the situation could read. You was the margin between coming home and not coming home. He told her he'd left the military 4 years ago, deliberately and without regret, because Sadie was 5 and her mother was gone, and the choice between being a SEAL and being Sadie's father wasn't actually a complicated choice once he sat down and made himself look at it clearly. He told her he'd chosen a maintenance job at Westbridge specifically because it was quiet, because it was useful, and because it let him be home every night. He didn't tell her how long it had taken him to sleep through the night without waking up in tactical assessment mode. He didn't tell her about the 6 months after he left the service when the silence of a civilian apartment felt physically wrong, like pressure in his ears that wouldn't equalize. Some things were context. Some things were just his. Natalie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone processing surprise, but the silence of someone who'd suspected something and was confirming it. "The garage," she said. "You weren't scared." "I was paying attention," he said. "That's different." Most people would have kept walking. Most people hadn't spent 8 years in situations where keeping walking got people killed. He said it flatly, not dramatically. "I'm not built the same way anymore. That's not a boast. It just means I'm useful in a specific context and you happen to be in that context. And you think this is that kind of situation." "Think," he said, "that Conrad Voss has been running a sophisticated financial operation for 4 years, has people positioned inside your organization, has already attempted 2 felonies in the last 18 hours, and has a missing internal auditor hidden somewhere who is apparently the only person with enough physical evidence to dismantle everything Conrad has built." He picked up the maintenance log photograph from where he'd set his phone down. "Yes, I think this is that kind of situation." She nodded slowly. "Then, the auditor, Miles Corwin. The drive has a note in one of the subfolders. I almost missed it this morning. A text file, no label, just a string of characters that looked like an address." Ronan looked at her. "You didn't mention that." "I didn't know if it was an address until just now, when you said hidden somewhere." She picked up her own phone and navigated to a photograph she'd taken of the drive's contents before handing it to Ronan that morning. 11 characters, a street number and a partial name. Harwick Wharf. Ronan knew the waterfront district. It was 2 miles east, old industrial, the kind of area that cities designated for development every 10 years and then ran out of money before the designated development materialized. Vanguard owned property out there. He'd seen the company name on a chain-link fence surrounding a warehouse complex when he'd done a delivery run in that direction 6 months ago. "That's Vanguard property," he said. "Yes," she said. "A decommissioned warehouse we've been holding for 18 months, waiting on a zoning reclassification. Which means it's on the company's books. Which means Conrad knows it exists. But if Miles chose it," Ronan said, "he chose it knowing Conrad wouldn't expect him to hide somewhere Conrad owns. Which is either very smart or very desperate." "Miles was always very smart," Natalie said. "The desperate part is new." He called Sadie's school from the parking lot while Natalie stood out of earshot and spoke to the school secretary, a woman named Patrice, who had Ronan's number on a short list of people authorized to leave messages for Sadie's teacher. He asked Patrice to let the teacher know Sadie should go directly to the after-school program today and that he'd pick her up himself no later than 6. He didn't explain why. Patrice didn't ask, because Ronan had never called with a strange request before, and people who never asked for special treatment tended to get it extended to them without interrogation when they finally did ask. He stood for a moment after the call, phone in his hand. Sadie's school was 4 blocks from Westbridge. She walked it with 2 other kids from the building every morning, a routine so embedded in her daily geography that she could probably do it in her sleep. He'd walked it with her the first week, and then watched from the front step the second week, and then let her go. On the 3rd week, because at some point a 9-year-old had to be trusted to cover 4 blocks without her father watching from a distance. He thought about Conrad's people in the basement utility room 4 days ago, bypassing the electrical panel. He thought about how specific the targeting had been. They knew Natalie's route. They knew the building's electrical system. Specific knowledge, which came from specific sources. Put the phone in his pocket and went back to where Natalie was waiting. "We go to the waterfront," he said. "Not in your vehicles. Not in mine. We need a car that isn't connected to either of us. I can call No calls on your phone that mention where we're going. No calls through your company's communication system. He watched her face process this. Conrad's people are monitoring your network. That's not a guess. That's the only explanation for how they knew your route last night and had people positioned before you left the meeting. She looked at the two black SUVs at the curb, her security detail waiting with the patience of people paid for their patience. I can't just leave them here. Tell them you're meeting privately with a building resident to discuss the fire incident. True statement. Send them to the Vanguard Regional Office and have them pull the Westbridge maintenance contract history. Keep them busy with something real. He paused. And do not tell anyone where you're actually going. Not your assistant, not your security lead, not anyone inside the company. She studied him for a long moment. You really think Conrad has people that close to me? The garage proved it, he said. I know that's a hard thing to sit with, but we don't have time for it to be hard right now. Pulled in a breath. Let it out. Nodded once. Give me 3 minutes. He gave her 5 and used them to go back upstairs, check that 4C was locked, and leave a note for Mrs. Dela Cruz under her door, nothing specific, just going to take care of the building situation. Tonight, because she would worry, and she'd earned the right to not spend the day worrying without cause. They took a taxi. Natalie Ashbourne, CEO of Vanguard Crest Group, in a cab that smelled like pine air freshener and had a cracked sun visor held up with a strip of electrical tape. She sat in the back seat without comment and watched the city move past the window. And Ronan sat beside her and said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes, because there was nothing useful to say, and silence, in his experience, was underrated as a tool. How bad do you think it is? She said finally. Not the general situation, he could tell she meant Miles. Depends how long he's been in that warehouse, he said. If he went there voluntarily and he's been managing, he's okay. Conrad's people have been to that location already. Don't, you asked. I know, I asked. She looked at her hands in her lap. Miles has been with the company since before I took over as CEO. He sent me a birthday card every year. Actual card, envelope, handwritten note. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because you're worried about him, Ronan said. That's a reasonable thing to be. I should have paid more attention to his report. Conrad made sure you didn't see the real version of it. I should have paid more attention to why I wasn't hearing anything back from compliance, she said. That's on me. I had a coup. I trusted him in the specific way. That means you stop checking the work. She paused. That's a failure of leadership. Not a tragedy, not a conspiracy I couldn't have seen. Failure. Ronan didn't agree or disagree. He found her willingness to say it directly without either minimizing it or performing excessive guilt more useful than almost anything else she could have said. The taxi turned east onto the waterfront access road, and the city changed texture around them. The glass and steel of the financial district gave way to lower buildings, older materials, stretches of fence and industrial gate, and the particular flatness of land that had been cleared and held. The harbor was visible between structures, gray water, flat light, the distant geometry of container cranes on the far shore. The warehouse complex is at the end of this road, Natalie said. There's a management gate, padlocked. I have the code. What's the normal security level on a property like that? Exterior cameras, motion triggered. The system reports to our facilities management server. She caught herself, which Conrad's people can access. Cameras won't matter if we're already inside before anyone checks the feed, Ronan said. How long does the system take to flag a motion alert? 15 minutes to notification unless someone is actively monitoring. Then we move fast. He leaned forward and asked the driver to stop 2 blocks short of the gate. The driver did, and they got out. And Ronan paid in cash because Natalie was already reaching for her card, and a card left a timestamp and a location. She looked at him as he pocketed the change. You do that automatically, she said. Do what? Think 2 steps ahead all the time. Old habit, he said. Come on. The warehouse complex was 3 connected structures behind a chain-link perimeter, the kind of industrial property that had been built for a specific manufacturing purpose that no longer existed and was now waiting to become something else. The management gate had a combination padlock. Natalie worked the combination from memory, a 5-digit sequence she entered with her shoulders, angled to block the view from the road, and the lock opened on the second try because the first try her hands weren't quite steady and she missed the last digit. Sorry, she said. Don't be, he said. You're doing fine. Inside the fence, Ronan moved along the edge of the nearest structure rather than across open ground, staying close to the wall, where the cameras on the fence line would have difficulty tracking. He'd seen the camera positions on the approach and mapped the angles. Not out of paranoia, just the way he moved through spaces he didn't fully control. The 3 warehouses were connected by interior passages. The first 2 were completely empty concrete floors, high ceilings, the smell of old industry and standing damp. The third, at the far end of the complex, had a small office module built into one corner, a prefabricated box within a box that an operations team had probably used when the site was active. The office window had light behind it. Not electric light, the power was almost certainly off to this property. Something lower and steadier. A battery lantern or a flashlight propped to illuminate a work area. Ronan put a hand out and Natalie stopped walking. He listened. No voices. No sounds of movement inside. Just the light and the particular quality of occupied stillness, the way a space feels different when someone is in it versus genuinely empty. He crossed the last stretch of floor and knocked twice on the office door. Paused, knocked once more. Silence. Natalie said it over Ronan's shoulder, not loudly, but clearly. It's Natalie. I have the drive. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the sound of something being moved, furniture, or a box, or a body unfolding itself from a cramped position. A lock disengaged. The door opened. Miles Corwin was in his late 40s, slight, with the kind of pallor that comes from spending a week in a building, with no natural light and not enough food. His glasses were missing one arm and were held in place on the left side by a strip of tape identical in color, Ronan noticed, to the tape on the taxi's sun visor. He was wearing the same suit he'd been wearing at the Vanguard investor event 6 days ago, though the jacket was now serving as a blanket on a folding cot pushed against the office wall. He looked at Natalie, then at Ronan, then back at Natalie. Who is he? Miles said. Someone who lives at Westbridge, she said. He helped me last night. He's the reason I still have the drive. Miles looked at Ronan for another moment, with the careful, assessing look of an auditor evaluating a document he hasn't seen before. You're the maintenance man, he said. R. Beckett. Your name is on the forged engineering report. I know, Ronan said. I'd like to do something about that. Miles stepped back from the door and let them in. The office was approximately 12 feet square and contained a folding table, 2 chairs, the cot, a battery lantern, 2 empty water bottles, a half-eaten sleeve of crackers, and approximately 300 pages of physical documents organized into labeled folders with the methodical care of a man who understood that the physical copies were the only ones Conrad couldn't delete. Miles had been inside the warehouse for 6 days. He'd come here because it was the one Vanguard property he was certain Conrad would overlook, not because Conrad didn't know it existed, but because using a company property as a hiding place was so obviously inadvisable that it created its own camouflage. He'd been right so far. He'd had one close moment on day 3, when a vehicle had circled the exterior fence slowly enough to suggest purposeful inspection, but it had left without stopping. He'd had water from a tap in the main warehouse that still ran. He'd had the crackers and 2 energy bars and 1 cup of instant coffee made with cold water because there was nothing to heat it with. He'd been rationing everything and focusing on the documents because as long as the documents were organized, there was a reason to be here. I need you to understand what you're holding, he said, sitting across from Natalie at the folding table with the folders arranged between them. He spoke with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation many times in a room by himself. The drive is a summary. These indicated the folders are the primary sources. The drive is useless without them. Anyone Conrad sends after the drive who doesn't know about these documents leaves, without the ability to reconstruct what he's done. Why didn't you put everything on the drive? Ronan said. Because I couldn't compress 3 years of financial records into files small enough to pass undetected, Miles said. And because I was afraid of exactly what happened, the drive getting intercepted before it reached anyone who could act on it. He looked at Natalie. I needed to reach you. In person. With both. You're here, she said. Yes. He looked at his hands. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure you'd look at what I sent. I wasn't sure. He stopped. You weren't sure I wasn't part of it, she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Show me what you have, she said. All of it. Miles talked for 40 minutes. He walked them through the folder structure with the focused economy of a man who'd been waiting days for the chance to say this to someone who could act on it. The shell company architecture, the payment flows, the timeline of building deteriorations correlated against Conrad's acquisition activity, the internal communications he'd recovered from a server backup Conrad had thought was wiped, the specific alterations that had been made to Miles's original compliance report after it went to Conrad's office. He also showed them the maintenance reduction approvals. They were in a separate folder, clearly labeled. 12 documents spanning 3 years, each bearing Natalie's signature, each approving a reduction in maintenance expenditure for a specific property on Conrad's deterioration schedule. The signature was genuine. The context in which it had been obtained, buried within larger operational efficiency packages, presented without the surrounding evidence of what those reductions were actually enabling, was the manipulation. Natalie looked at them for a long time. Ronan watched her face. It went through several things, none of them simple. There was the first layer reaction, which was the shock of seeing your name attached to something you didn't fully understand when you signed it. Then there was the second layer reaction, which was the honest reckoning with the fact that not fully understanding something you sign is still a choice you made. He watched her work through both of those things without trying to resolve them prematurely, and he thought, she's going to be okay. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. I need to ask you something, Ronan said to Miles. Miles looked at him. Ask. The people Conrad has inside Natalie's security network. Do you know how many or who? Miles considered. I have communications suggesting he has a primary contact inside the executive security team. I don't have a name, but I have an account identifier that compliance can trace. He pulled a folder. It's in here. I also have evidence suggesting he has someone in the IT infrastructure team who's been providing access to internal communications. So a board meeting isn't safe, Ronan said. Nothing that goes through the company's internal systems is safe, Miles said. Conrad can see it before it happens. Ronan looked at Natalie. She was still looking at the documents with her signature on them. There's something else, Miles said. He said it with the careful tone of someone delivering a secondary piece of bad news to a person who's already handling primary bad news. Conrad knows the drive is still out there. I intercepted a communication 3 days ago through an account he didn't know I had access to. He's not waiting for the board meeting. He's planning to move against Westbridge directly and accelerate the condemnation order through the forged report. If that condemnation goes through in the next 72 hours, the residents have to leave. Once they leave, the building can be declared unsafe for habitation, and Conrad's acquisition chain moves. Can it be stopped? Natalie said. The forged report can be invalidated, Ronan said. But that requires someone with engineering credentials willing to file a counter-assessment, and it requires doing it before the municipal review window closes. He paused. How long do we have? Miles checked a document. The review window closes tomorrow at 5 p.m., 24 hours. Approximately. Ronan stood up from his chair and walked to the small office window. Outside, through grimy glass, the waterfront light was the flat gray of an overcast afternoon. He could see the edge of the fence line, the chain link catching the ambient light, and beyond it the empty road. He was thinking through what he knew about Conrad Voss, which was still largely structural rather than personal, the architecture of what Conrad had built, rather than the specifics of how Conrad would react when that architecture was threatened. People who'd spent years building something elaborate tended to overestimate the architecture and underestimate the humans who'd been affected by it. Conrad had spent 4 years looking at spreadsheets. He hadn't spent 4 years looking at Martinosi navigating a dark stairwell or misses. Delacruz standing in a smoke-filled corridor holding a bag of important documents. That was Conrad's mistake. He's going to know we found you, Ronan said. Not immediately. But the cameras on the fence line reported motion when we came in. Within 15 minutes of that report, someone in facilities management sees it. If that someone is connected to Conrad, he knows we're here within the hour. Miles straightened. Then we need to move the documents. We need to move everything, Ronan said. He turned from the window. Can you walk? I've been sitting in a warehouse for 6 days, Miles said. I can walk. There's an independent forensic accounting firm that handles municipal audit work, Natalie said. She was standing now, the documents with her signature still on the table in front of her. They're not connected to Vanguard in any way. I use them for external verification. Their office is in the Meridian building, downtown. Do they have secure document intake? Ronan said. Yes, and they're bonded for legal chain of custody handling. She looked at the folders. These go to them directly. Conrad can't touch them. They become part of an independent audit record. Then that's where they go, Ronan said. Miles started gathering the folders with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd organized them specifically so they could be gathered quickly. Natalie picked up the stack he handed her without being asked and held it with both arms, the same way she'd held her handbag in the parking garage 20 hours ago. Different weight. Completely different things she was protecting. Ronan was at the door, reading the space beyond the office, the warehouse interior, the long stretch of concrete to the far exit when headlights swept the exterior window. Not the road. The interior of the fence line. A vehicle had come through the management gate. "How many ways out of this complex?" Ronan said, without turning from the window. Natalie answered immediately because she'd been inside this property twice during its acquisition, and her brain worked in spatial categories, the way people's brains worked in whatever medium they'd spent their careers thinking in. "The main gate we came through. A secondary vehicle access at the south end, also padlocked. And a pedestrian emergency exit in the west wall of this building, by the fire suppression station. Key or bar. Push to open. That's where we go," he said. "Miles, take what you can carry in one load. Leave nothing that can be read quickly. Everything that stays face down." Miles was already moving. Ronan pulled the office door and held it, and the three of them went out into the warehouse dark. The battery lantern left behind on the folding table, still lit, because a light in an empty room buys 45 seconds of false confidence in the people who come through the door behind you, and 45 seconds, when you're crossing 100 feet of open concrete floor to an emergency exit, is exactly what you need. They were through the exit door and moving along the exterior of the building, away from the fence line, into the narrow service corridor between the warehouse and the perimeter wall, by the time the sound of voices echoed inside the building behind them. Ronan didn't look back. He counted his people, Natalie to his left, Miles to his right, both moving, both upright, and he kept moving, because the first rule of an exit was that you kept moving until you were out. And out meant far enough from the problem that the problem couldn't see you anymore. The service corridor led to a gap in the perimeter wall at the property's north end, a section where the concrete block had partially collapsed and been left unrepaired, the kind of maintenance-deferred decision that had probably been on a list somewhere for months. Ronan had seen it's on the approach. He'd filed it away, because that was the way he moved through space. They went through the gap one at a time. Miles first, because he was carrying documents and needed both hands and the most help with the uneven footing. Natalie second. Ronan last, turning once to look back down the service corridor empty, no pursuit visible. The sound of voices still coming from inside the warehouse rather than outside it. They walked north, away from the property line, into the ordinary streets of the waterfront district, three people carrying a stack of folders on a cold afternoon, which was strange, but not strange enough to stop a stranger on the street. Ronan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Sadie's school, the automated after-school check-in notification. She was in the program. She was fine. He kept walking. Behind him, somewhere in the warehouse, Conrad's people were looking at a battery lantern on a folding table and working out how long they'd missed them by. Ronan intended to make sure they never got another close look. The Meridian building was 12 blocks from the waterfront, a mid-rise from the 1980s that had aged into respectability the way some buildings did not, by being renovated into something unrecognizable, but by simply persisting long enough that its original materials became character rather than liability. The forensic accounting firm Natalie had named occupied the 7th floor. The lobby security desk required photo ID and a signed visitor log, which under normal circumstances was standard procedure, and under these circumstances meant that anyone tracking Natalie's movements through official channels would have a record of her location within the hour. Ronan mentioned this on the sidewalk outside. "We could use a different entry point," Natalie said. "The building has a secondary entrance through the parking structure on the west side. Residents use it. There's no desk. You know this building well. I've been here for audits." She adjusted the stack of folders in her arms. Miles was beside her, carrying the remainder, looking slightly less pale now that he was in open air and moving, though his borrowed tape glasses kept sliding down his nose, and he kept pushing them up with his wrist because his hands were full. "The firm's senior partner is a woman named Ellison Webb. She knows me. She won't ask questions I don't want to answer in a lobby." "Call her from outside," Ronan said. "Tell her you need secure document intake today, not scheduled. Tell her you're coming through the parking entrance and to meet you at the elevator." Natalie was already pulling out her phone. She made the call standing between two parked cars in the street, speaking quietly and precisely, and the conversation lasted 90 seconds. When she hung up, she said, "She'll meet us in 4 minutes." They went through the parking structure. Ellison Webb was waiting at the elevator bank. When the doors opened on 7, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses, pushed up into silver-streaked hair, and the particular unflappable expression of someone who'd spent 3 decades reviewing financial documents and had stopped being surprised by what they contained. She looked at Natalie, then at Miles, then at Ronan, then at the folders. "Conference room B," she said. "It's clean and it records chain of custody automatically." She didn't ask what was in the folders until they were seated, and the door was closed, and the conference room's automatic documentation system had logged the time and attendees. Then she asked, and Miles told her, and she listened, the way experienced auditors listened without visible reaction, taking notes on a legal pad in a small, economical hand, occasionally asking a clarifying question about a date or an account number. When Miles finished, she looked at her legal pad, then at the folders, then at Natalie. "You have 72 hours before the condemnation review," she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question, because she'd been listening carefully enough to already know. "Less," Ronan said. "The review window closes tomorrow at 5. She looked at him with the mildly appraising expression of someone encountering a new variable and assessing its relevance. "And you are?" "Ronan Beckett. My name is on the forged engineering report." "I see." She wrote his name on her legal pad. "I have a contact at the municipal planning office who can flag the report for administrative review. That doesn't stop the clock, but it buys time while a counter-assessment is filed." She looked at Natalie. "You need a licensed structural engineer willing to assess Westbridge on short notice." "I know one," Natalie said. "He's independent, not connected to Vanguard." "Get him there tonight," Ellison said. "If the counter-assessment is in the system, before the review window closes, the condemnation order can't go forward until both reports are reconciled. That process takes weeks." "Weeks is enough," Ronan said. "Weeks is enough for the legal side," Ellison said. "The documents and the drive go into secure intake today. I'll have 2 analysts begin the reconstruction of the financial trail tonight. We'll work through it." She looked at the folders. "This is meticulous work, Mr. Corwin." Miles pushed his glasses up with his wrist again. "I had 6 days and not much else to do," he said. "Came out of the Meridian building at 3:20 in the afternoon, back through the parking structure, into the gray light of a day that was threatening to become evening faster than Ronan was comfortable with. Miles was lighter, without the folders, which seemed to have a physical effect on him beyond the literal weight. Some of the compression had left his posture, though his face was still the face of a man who hadn't slept adequately in a week. "You need somewhere to stay," Ronan said to him. "I can't go back to my apartment." "Not yet." "Do you have someone, family, a friend? Someone Conrad's people don't know about?" Miles thought. "My sister. She lives in Rennick, 40 minutes out. She doesn't know any of this. Conrad wouldn't know she exists." "Call her from a payphone," Ronan said. "There's one outside the post office on Crail Street, 3 blocks from here. It still works. I've seen it." He said it without elaborating on why he'd noticed a working payphone on Crail Street, because the answer was that he noticed every functional piece of infrastructure in his neighborhood out of the same reflexive habit that made him notice electrical panels and camera positions. "A payphone," Miles said. "Yes." Miles looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man from a generation that still remembered payphones, but hadn't used one in 15 years. "All right," he said. They walked him to the post office. He went in to find change. Ronan stood on the sidewalk with Natalie, and they were both quiet for a moment, in the way of people who've been moving fast and have briefly, unexpectedly, stopped. "The board meeting," Natalie said. "What about it?" "Conrad will have called one by now. He knows the drive is still out there. He knows his people missed us at the warehouse, and he's not the kind of person who sits and waits." She was looking at the street rather than at Ronan, thinking aloud. "He'll go to the board before I can. He'll frame this as a security breach, an employee gone rogue, possibly implicate me in whatever version of the story makes him safest. Can he do that? He has 11 years of credibility inside that company. I've been CCO for 4. The board knows him better than they know me in some respects." She paused. "He'll tell them I'm being manipulated by a building employee with a personal interest in avoiding eviction. And he'll say it in a way that sounds reasonable, because Conrad is very good at sounding reasonable." Ronan listened to this without interrupting. "He's not wrong that you have a personal interest," she said. "No," Ronan agreed. "He's not wrong about that. Does that bother you? That part of what you're doing is for yourself?" He thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for a clean answer. I've got 120 families in a building that someone's trying to empty out from under them. Mrs. Delacruz has lived here for 19 years. Martin Osi is 74 and his knees don't work on stairs. The Khatri kids go to school 2 blocks away. He paused. Yes, I live here too. Yes, Sadie goes to that school. That doesn't make it wrong that I'm doing something about it. It just makes me honest about why. Natalie was quiet for a moment. I need to be at that board meeting, she said. Whatever Conrad says, I need to be there to answer it. I know, he said, but not today. Today, the documents go into secure intake. The structural engineer goes to Westbridge tonight, and Conrad doesn't know where you are or what you've submitted. He looked at her. Let him make his move first. When you walk into that meeting, you walk in with everything already in place. She absorbed that. You're asking me to let him control the timing. I'm asking you to let him think he's controlling the timing, Ronan said. There's a difference. Miles came out of the post office looking slightly bewildered by the mechanical experience of using a payphone, but otherwise intact. His sister would pick him up at the bus station in an hour. He had bus fare from his wallet, which had survived the warehouse week, in his jacket pocket, and he had Ellison Webb's direct number, which Natalie had given him. And he had the careful, exhausted look of a man who had done something genuinely difficult and was starting to believe it had mattered. Thank you, he said to Ronan. He said it simply, without performance. Thank Natalie, Ronan said. She came. Miles looked at Natalie. Something passed between them, not an apology exactly, more the acknowledgement of the gap between what he'd feared about her and what she'd turned out to be when it counted. I wasn't sure, he said. I know, she said. I wasn't sure either. About a lot of things. They put him in a taxi with cash from Ronan's wallet, which he would pay back later without making it a significant moment, because it wasn't a significant amount, and making it significant would be embarrassing for both of them. The taxi pulled away. Ronan watched it go and then looked at Natalie. Structural engineer, he said. Make that call now. She made 3 calls in the next 20 minutes, standing on the sidewalk outside the post office. The structural engineer, a man named Darian Voss, no relation to Conrad and clearly accustomed to Natalie's direct communication style, agreed to be at Westbridge at 7 that evening. The second call went to Natalie's personal attorney, not the company's legal team, with specific instructions about the document submission at Ellison Webb's firm and what it meant for the condemnation review. The third call was internal, to a senior board member named Patricia Holt, whom Natalie described afterward as the one person on the board she trusted completely and who was also the one person Conrad had never been able to fully get to. What did you tell her? Ronan said. That there would be an emergency board meeting in the morning and that she should not accept any version of the agenda that Conrad circulates beforehand. Will she do it? Patricia has been on that board for 14 years and she's survived 4 CEOs and 2 market collapses by being the person who reads everything twice before she agrees to anything. Natalie put her phone away. She'll do it. They took the subway back toward Westbridge, another cash decision. Ronan buying 2 Metro cards from a machine, rather than using a linked account because the subway was faster than a cab in the afternoon traffic, and also because Natalie had now been in 2 cabs and 1 subway car today, and that variety of movement made a tracking pattern significantly harder to establish than a single repeated route. She sat beside him on the train with the particular posture of someone exercising deliberate normalcy in an unfamiliar context. Car was half full, a woman with grocery bags, 2 teenagers sharing earbuds, a man in work clothes asleep against the window. Ordinary city afternoon. Can I ask you something? Natalie said. She kept her voice low, not secret-keeping low, just considerate of the space. You can ask, he said, when you left the seals. Was it hard? He looked at the floor of the car for a moment. In some ways. Not the way people usually mean when they ask that. What way, then? The work itself, I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, and there's something specific about doing a thing you're genuinely built for. Leaving that is strange. Not painful exactly, but strange, he paused. The hard part was figuring out what the skills were actually for, once the context was gone. And it turns out they're for the same thing, different scale. He looked up at the car ceiling. Nobody should be getting hurt by the people who are supposed to be responsible for their safety. Doesn't matter if you're in a hostile environment overseas or in your own apartment building. Principle's the same. Natalie thought about that for a moment. Conrad would say he's not responsible for the residents. They're tenants. It's a contractual relationship. Conrad would be wrong, Ronan said. And I think you know that now. I think I always knew it, she said. I just wasn't paying attention to it the way I should have been. Train slowed into the Crail Street station. They got off. The walk from the station to Westbridge was 4 blocks, and the building came into view at the end of the second block, 11 stories of aging concrete against the late afternoon sky, lights coming on in windows as the day went down, ordinary inhabited look of a place where people were coming home. Ronan stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at it. He thought about Conrad Voss sitting somewhere tonight, a clean office, a car with good suspension, a dinner reservation, looking at Westbridge on a spreadsheet and seeing a number with a projected value and a timeline. Thought about what Conrad saw when he looked at that building and what Ronan saw when he looked at it. And the distance between those two views was not a moral abstraction. It was Martinosi's knees on a dark stairwell. It was Mrs. Delacruz's bag of documents held against her chest. It was Sadie's sleep on a neighbor's couch because her father worked late keeping the heat on. "Let's go in," he said. Sadie was home by 5:30, delivered by the after-school program coordinator, who occasionally walked kids back to the building on late pickups. She came through the door of 4C with her backpack riding low on one shoulder and a drawing she'd made in art class, something involving what appeared to be a very large orange dog, standing next to a much smaller blue figure that Ronan chose to interpret as a human being. She stopped when she saw Natalie. Natalie was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of actual coffee. Ronan had made it from the bag on the counter, the real kind, not the machine downstairs, and a legal pad she'd borrowed from Ronan's desk drawer, on which she'd been working through notes on the board meeting preparation. Sadie looked at Natalie, then at her father, then back at Natalie, with the particular assessing expression of a 9-year-old who understood more about adult situations than adults typically wanted to credit. "Hi," Sadie said, to Natalie specifically. "Hi," Natalie said. "I'm Natalie. I work with your dad on the building stuff. He doesn't usually bring building stuff people home," Sadie said. "Sadie," Ronan said. "I'm not being rude," Sadie said, with the dignity of someone making a distinction. "I'm observing. The building situation is more complicated than usual," Ronan said. Ms. Ashbourne needed somewhere to work for a few hours. Sadie considered this. "Is our building going to be okay?" Question landed in the room with the weight of a question, asked in total good faith by someone who didn't know how to ask it any other way. Ronan looked at his daughter, her backpack still on, her drawing in her hand, her face entirely open and waiting for an honest answer. "Yes," he said. "We're working on making sure it is." Sadie looked at Natalie. "Are you helping?" "I'm trying to," Natalie said. Sadie seemed to find this acceptable. She dropped her backpack by the door, held out the drawing to show it to her father, and said the large orange shape was not a dog but a fox, and the blue figure was her. And the reason the fox was much larger than the person was an artistic choice about relative importance, which was apparently something her art teacher had discussed this week. Ronan took the drawing and looked at it with appropriate seriousness. "It's good," he said. "I know," she said, and went to change out of her school clothes. Natalie watched this exchange with an expression that had come slightly loose from the controlled composure she'd been maintaining most of the day. It wasn't dramatic. It was the small, involuntary softening of someone watching something that was simply human and unpretentious and had nothing to do with board meetings or shell companies or forged engineering reports. She looked back at her legal pad. "She's good," she said quietly. "She's 9, Ronan said. 9 is its own thing." Darian Voss arrived at Westbridge at 7:05, a deliberate 5 minutes late in the way of someone who managed their schedule by small margins. He was a compact man in his early 60s with a structural engineer's habit of looking at ceilings and walls rather than people when he first entered a space, assessing load paths and material conditions the way Ronan assessed exits. He did a thorough examination of the foundation access points, the load-bearing walls on 3 floors, the basement structural elements, and the external facade at 4 corners, with Ronan walking alongside him and pointing out what he knew and staying quiet when he didn't. At 9:15, Darian sat in the maintenance office with his assessment notes and said, "This building is structurally sound. The foundation is aging, but within acceptable parameters. There is no basis for the condemnation characterization in the existing report." Can you say that in a filed document?" Natalie said. "I just did," he said. "The filed version will have more numbers attached to it." He filed the counter-assessment digitally at 9:47, with a hard copy sent by overnight courier to the municipal planning office and a second copy emailed directly to Ellison Webb for the audit record. The timestamp would be visible in the system. The condemnation review, when it opened tomorrow, would find two contradictory professional assessments and would be required by procedure to suspend action until they were reconciled. Ronan walked Darian out to his car and thanked him. Darian said he'd been wanting to correct bad engineering work for years, and this was a better version of doing it than most. He drove away. Ronan stood on the front step of Westbridge in the night air and let himself feel, for the first time since the previous midnight, that the situation had moved from almost certainly bad to possibly manageable. That was not the same as good, but it was different from where it had been 24 hours ago. He went back upstairs. Natalie was at the kitchen table, still on the legal pad. Sadie had been asleep for 2 hours. The apartment had the specific quiet of a place where a child is sleeping, and adults are managing not to disturb that. Ronan poured himself a glass of water and sat down across from her. "The board meeting is at 10 tomorrow morning," she said. "Conrad called it an hour ago. I have it from Patricia. What's the stated agenda? Security concerns within Vanguard's executive function," which is accurate in the specific way that a statement can be accurate while meaning something completely different from what actually happened. She set down her pen. "He's going to present this as an insider threat. He'll characterize Miles as a disgruntled employee who stole documents, characterize me as someone who was compromised by a personal relationship with a building tenant. He knows about last night," Ronan said. "It wasn't a question. He knows enough. My name in a maintenance office. A building fire the same morning. A CEO who didn't show up at company headquarters all day." She looked at her legal pad. "He'll make it a coherent story. He's good at coherent stories. What do you need to walk in there and counter it? Everything we have. The documents at Ellison's firm, the drive, Darian's assessment, the maintenance photographs from the basement, the log entry for K, the surveillance from your backup system, if it shows what you think it shows." She paused. "And I need to be prepared to say the things that are true and uncomfortable, the things he'll try to use against me before I can say them myself." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "The maintenance reduction approvals. My signature on 12 documents that Conrad used to hurt people." She said it without looking away. "Yes, those. If you bring those yourself before he does, it changes what they mean." "It changes what they mean legally," she said. "Not what they mean in fact." "No," he agreed. "Not in fact." She pulled a specific page from the legal pad notes she'd made in the last hour. He could tell by the placement, the ink still looking fresh under the kitchen light. She looked at it. Then she looked at Ronan with a directness that came from something other than professional calculation. "If I walk in there tomorrow and own what I actually did, not what Conrad did, what I did, there's a version of this where I lose the company," she said. "The board might decide the appropriate response to my failures is to remove me from the CEO position while the company is under investigation." "That's possible," Ronan said. "And you think I should do it anyway?" He looked at her for a long moment. He was aware of Sadie asleep in the other room, of the building quiet around them, of Mrs. Dela Cruz's television probably still on through the floor of 4D, the muffled sound of it a frequency he'd stopped consciously hearing months ago and now only noticed when he paid attention. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. "You're the one who has to live with it. But there's a question I'd be asking myself if I were you." She waited. "When Sadie asks me what kind of woman saved our home," he said, "what do you want me to tell her?" Kitchen was quiet. The building settled around them. Outside, on Crail Street, a car passed slowly, and its headlights moved across the ceiling in a long sweep, and were gone. Natalie looked at the legal pad. She looked at the notes she'd made. The framework of a board presentation built on calculation and positioning, and the management of what got revealed and what got withheld. Pulled the page from the pad, set it aside, started writing on the clean page beneath it. She wrote for a long time without speaking, and Ronan got up at some point and made more coffee and set a cup near her without comment. And she reached for it without looking up, and the building held them both in its imperfect aging, structurally sound walls, and outside, without either of them yet knowing it. Ellison Webb's analysts were already 3 hours into reconstructing the financial architecture of a 4-year scheme that was about to be unwound from the inside out. Natalie wrote until the notes said what she actually meant rather than what was safest to say. Then she looked up. "Everything," she said, "including what I signed." Ronan nodded. "All right," he said. Natalie left Ronan's apartment at 6:15 in the morning in the same clothes she'd arrived in the day before, which was something she'd have considered unthinkable 48 hours ago, and now barely registered as a detail worth thinking about. Ronan had offered her the couch, and she'd taken it without the performance of polite refusal, because they were both past the point where that kind of social friction served any purpose. She'd slept 4 hours, which was 3 more than she'd expected. Ronan was already up when she woke, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and his phone, reviewing the photographs he'd taken in the basement, the electrical cabinet, the bypass configuration, the maintenance log with its single anonymous entry. He'd been awake longer than 4 hours. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the kind that came from someone who'd already done their thinking and was now just waiting for the day to start. "The board meeting is at 10, she said. "I know." He pushed a cup toward her without being asked. Ellison Webb called at 5:30. Her team worked through the night. They have a complete reconstruction of Conrad's shell company structure, transaction by transaction, going back 4 years. She's filing it with the independent investigators this morning. Natalie sat down. "That's faster than I expected." Miles's documentation was that thorough, Ronan said. 9 years in compliance. He knew exactly what he was building, and he built it so someone else could read it. She drank the coffee. It was better than yesterday's. He'd adjusted something about the ratio. Or maybe she was just more tired, and therefore less discriminating. Either way, it was warm and real, and she held the cup with both hands and let herself have 30 seconds of not being the CEO of anything before the day required her to be that again. "I need to go home first," she said. "Change. Get my documentation together. Your security team will be watching your apartment." "My security team works for me," she said. "Conrad's contact inside the team is one person. I called my security director last night. From your landline, you have a landline." "Came with the apartment," he said. "Never got rid of it. I called him and told him what I know about the internal leak. He confirmed which account identifier Miles had flagged. Person has been suspended and removed from my detail as of midnight last night." She set down her cup. "My apartment is clean." Ronan absorbed this. "You did that last night. While you were walking Darian out," she said. "I'm not entirely dependent on your operational instincts, Ronan. I have some of my own." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Fair enough," he said. She stood. She straightened her jacket, which had developed a crease across one shoulder from the couch that was not going to survive contact with a boardroom. That was all right. She'd walked into harder rooms looking worse and come out the other side. Crease was the least of what she was carrying into that meeting. "There's one more thing," she said. He looked at her. "The maintenance photographs from the basement, the sabotage evidence. I need everything you have on your backup surveillance system that connects Conrad's contractors to the building fire and the garage attack." She paused. "Can you pull that together in the next 2 hours?" "I've had it compiled since 5 a.m., he said. Of course he had. She was gone by 6:30. Ronan woke Sadie at 7, made her eggs scrambled, the only way she'd eat them, which had been a years-long negotiation that he'd eventually conceded because scrambled eggs were not a hill worth dying on, and sat with her while she ate, and told him about a project at school involving rivers and which rivers she'd been assigned, and whether the Nile or the Amazon was more interesting, a debate she had strong opinions about. He let her talk. He listened to her the way he always listened to her, in the mornings, not half paying attention, not processing her words while thinking about something else, but actually listening, because these were the specific minutes of the day that belonged entirely to her, and he'd decided early on that they were not negotiable. After she left for school 4 blocks, 2 friends from the building, the same route she'd walked 100 times, Ronan stood at the window of 4C and watched the street below until he saw the 3 of them turn the corner at the end of the block and disappear from view. Then he picked up the folder he'd compiled and his phone and went downstairs. He had something to do before the board meeting that wasn't in any plan he'd discussed with Natalie, because it wasn't her responsibility to do it, and it was his. He knocked on Mrs. Delacruz's door. She answered in her housecoat, television already on behind her, a cup of something hot in her hand. She looked at Ronan the way she'd been looking at him for 4 years, with a combination of warmth and measured expectation that meant she was glad to see him and also waiting to find out what the visit meant. "The building situation," he said. "I wanted to tell you directly. It's going to be resolved. It's going to take a few more days, but the evacuation threat is not going to stand." She studied his face. "I'm sure," he said. "I've been working on it." "With the woman who came yesterday," she said. "The one in the good car." He should have known, Mrs. Delacruz was 71 and had 19 years of watching, who came and went from this building. "Yes," he said. "With her." She nodded slowly. "She seemed serious." "And you're serious." That's generally my situation, he said. She reached out and patted his arm once, the brief, decisive way she had of communicating things she didn't put into words, and then she said, I made too much soup last night. I'll leave some outside your door. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, and closed her door. Ronan stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went down the hall and knocked on 3 more doors. The Khatri family, Martin Osi, the woman from 5B with the 3 sweaters, whose name was Patricia Elam, and who worked the early shift at a hospital 2 miles away and had just gotten home. He told each of them the same thing he'd told Mrs. Delacruz, in the same direct language, without promising more than he could deliver. He told them it was going to take a few more days, and they didn't need to pack anything. Martin Osi shook his hand at the door of 9A and held it for a moment and said nothing, which was its own kind of complete sentence. Patricia Elam asked if there was anything she could do to help, and he said the best thing she could do was go get some sleep, because she'd just worked a 12-hour shift and she looked like it. That's true, she said, and closed her door. The Vanguard Crest Group's board meeting convened at 10:03 in the company's downtown headquarters, a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor with a view of the city that had probably been selected to communicate something specific about the perspective of people who occupied it. There were 9 board members present in person and 2 dialed in by video. Conrad Voss was already seated when Natalie arrived, which she'd expected he'd have come early to set the room's expectations before she walked in. He had. Natalie could see it in the way the board members looked at her when she entered, not hostile, most of them, but carrying something. Preloaded information. The particular set of someone who's already heard one side of a story and is now adjusting their expression to appear neutral. Conrad was in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the well-maintained appearance of a man who'd understood early that looking like authority was half of having it. He watched Natalie take her seat across the table from him with an expression of professional concern that was the most precise kind of accusation, the kind that looked like sympathy. Natalie, he said, I'm glad you're here. I was concerned. I'm sure, she said. Tricia Holt, the board member she'd called the night before, was at the far end of the table, with her hands folded and her reading glasses on, and an expression that communicated exactly nothing, which was Patricia's version of active support. The board chair, a man named Gerhard Liss, who'd been in his position for 7 years, and managed it through the specific skill of being less interested in power than in process, opened the meeting and noted the agenda. Security and governance concern raised by the COO regarding recent activity within the company's executive function. Conrad presented for 22 minutes. It was, Natalie would admit privately, a well-constructed presentation. He framed Miles Corwin as a disgruntled auditor, whose compliance report had been legitimately reviewed and revised through proper channels, who had subsequently gone rogue, stolen confidential documents, and attempted to recruit the CEO into a personal grievance campaign. He framed the flash drive as stolen intellectual property. He framed the garage incident as a routine robbery that Natalie had allowed to become entangled with a building tenant's legal dispute. He framed Ronan as an individual with a direct financial interest in preventing a legitimate structural condemnation which was true, presented in a context designed to make true mean something other than what it actually was. He was good at this. He'd had 4 years of practice building coherent stories out of selected facts. When he finished, Gerhard Liss looked at Natalie. Natalie, your response. She had her folder on the table in front of her. She didn't open it yet. I'm going to tell you what I did wrong first, she said. Because it's relevant, and because it needs to be said before anything else, and because if I don't say it, Conrad will, and the order in which it gets said matters. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where people have stopped preparing their next thought and started actually listening. Over the past 3 years, I approved 12 maintenance budget reductions for residential properties in our portfolio. I approved them as part of operational efficiency packages that Conrad brought to me. I reviewed the numbers. I signed the approvals. I did not visit those properties. I did not meet the residents. I did not ask why those specific buildings needed those specific reductions at those specific times. She paused. That was a failure of leadership. Not a conspiracy. I was tricked into a failure of attention, of responsibility, of understanding what a property company actually is, which is not a collection of assets, but a collection of people's homes. My signature is on those documents. I own that. She let that sit. Conrad started to say something. She didn't look at him. Now I'm going to tell you what Conrad did, she said, and I'm going to show you the evidence. She opened the folder. She talked for 41 minutes. She walked the board through the shell company structure that Ellison Webb's team had reconstructed overnight, the financial transfers, the acquisition timeline, the deliberate deterioration schedule. She presented Miles Corwin's original compliance report alongside the altered version that had appeared in the system after it reached Conrad's office, with the differences annotated by Ellison's analysts in red. She presented the forged engineering report with Ronan's name on it, alongside Darian Voss's counter-assessment filed the previous evening, with a note from the Municipal Planning Office confirming that the condemnation review had been administratively flagged and was suspended pending reconciliation. She presented the maintenance photographs from Westbridge's basement, the bypass configuration of the electrical cabinet, the maintenance log entry, the specific failure pattern that Ronan had documented at 5 in the morning. Then she presented the surveillance footage. This was the piece she hadn't fully known about until Ronan had handed her a USB drive at 6:15 that morning and told her what was on it. Westbridge's maintenance backup system was a secondary recording loop that Ronan had installed himself 2 years ago, connected to 3 external cameras he'd mounted under the guise of building security upgrades, running on an independent network that didn't connect to any of the building's primary systems and therefore didn't appear on any of Vanguard's facility records. He'd built it specifically because the primary system kept malfunctioning, and he'd wanted a reliable record of who was accessing the building's service areas. What it had captured 4 days ago was a man entering through the building's service entrance at 4 in the morning, proceeding directly to the basement without signing in at the management office, and remaining in the basement utility room for 11 minutes. The footage wasn't high resolution, but it was clear it wasn't high resolution that when it was cross-referenced with the ID badge photographs from a private security contracting firm that investigators had already pulled in connection with the garage attack, the man in both images was identifiably the same person, one of Conrad's contractors, in Westbridge's basement, 4 days before the fire. The boardroom was completely silent. Conrad said that footage could have been manipulated by a maintenance worker, Natalie said, on a secondary system connected to an independent network that appears on none of our facility records and that Conrad therefore had no way of knowing existed. She looked at him directly for the first time since she'd started presenting. Where would a maintenance worker get the expertise to manipulate surveillance footage, Conrad? And why would he have done it? 4 days before your contractor sabotaged the building's electrical system. Conrad looked at his hands. It was a brief moment. He recovered his expression quickly, but brief was enough. Patricia Holt said, from the end of the table, I'd like to call a brief recess. The recess was 20 minutes. During that time, Natalie sat in a smaller conference room with her attorney, who had arrived that morning with the forensic audit submission from Ellison Webb's firm, and Patricia Holt, who sat across the table and read through the key documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had not survived 4 CEOs by being slow to process information. He's going to try to reframe the recess as an opportunity to negotiate, Patricia said, without looking up from the documents. I know, Natalie said. He'll offer to resign quietly in exchange for limiting the scope of the investigation. I know. What do you want to do about that? Nothing, Natalie said. The investigation isn't mine to limit. It's already in the hands of independent auditors and investigators. Can't negotiate what I don't control, and I made sure I don't control it before I walked into this room. Patricia looked up. She studied Natalie for a moment with the long practice expression of someone taking an accurate reading of a person. You did that deliberately. I did that deliberately, Natalie said. Because if I controlled the investigation, Conrad's argument that I'm managing this to protect myself would have some merit. This way, the outcome is whatever the evidence says it is. Including for me. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then, the board is going to ask about your role going forward, given the signed approvals. I know. Natalie folded her hands on the table. I'm accepting independent oversight of Vanguard's residential division. I'm voluntarily reducing my executive authority over property operations pending the investigation. And I'm recommending a governance restructure that puts resident representation into the decision-making process for every residential property we manage. She paused. If the board decides that's insufficient and wants my resignation, I'll hear that. But those are my terms for staying. Patricia nodded slowly. That's either very brave or very calculated. It's both, Natalie said. I'm a CEO, I don't get to pick only one. When the board reconvened, Conrad Voss did not make a negotiation offer. He made a statement. It was brief and it was, in its way, honest in the specific manner that statements made by people with nowhere left to maneuver were sometimes honest. He said that the redevelopment strategy had been his, that the operational decisions had been his, and that he had made them in what he believed was the company's best financial interest. He did not say he was sorry. He didn't say that he hadn't understood what he was doing to the families in those buildings, because that would have been untrue, and he was too precise a person to offer an obviously false defense when the room already knew better. What he said, stripped of everything else, was that he had decided the buildings were worth more than the people inside them, and he had acted on that decision systematically for 4 years. Nobody in the room said anything for several seconds after he stopped speaking. Then Gerhard List said, very quietly, "Thank you, Conrad." Conrad was removed from the meeting. His building access was suspended within the hour. The independent investigators, who had received Ellison Webb's complete submission that morning, had already been in contact with the appropriate authorities before the board meeting ended. The legal process moved from there in the way legal processes move, not quickly, not cleanly, but forward. The board voted on Natalie's continued leadership with the conditions she'd proposed. 6 in favor, 3 abstentions, 2 opposed. It was not a ringing endorsement. She hadn't expected one. She'd expected exactly what she got, enough. Called Ronan from the lobby of the Vanguard building at 12:47 in the afternoon. "It's done," she said. On his end, she could hear what sounded like the inside of Westbridge, the specific ambient sound of the building, the heating system, a door somewhere closing. He'd been there all morning, she knew, because he had a building to maintain, and the situation had not suspended the ordinary requirements of that. "Conrad," he said. "In investigator hands by end of day," she said. "The forged engineering report is being formally withdrawn from the Municipal Planning Office this afternoon. Condemnation review is closed." A pause. "And the residents?" "That's the next part," she said, "and I need your help with it." The meeting with Westbridge residents happened 3 days later, in the building's first-floor common room, a space that had been used primarily as storage for the past 2 years because the building's social infrastructure had deteriorated as methodically as everything else. Ronan spent 2 afternoons clearing it out and setting up folding chairs in rough rows and misses. Dela Cruz organized a phone tree that got the information to every occupied unit in the building, and on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, 63 residents of Westbridge Towers sat in folding chairs and looked at Natalie Ashbourne, who stood at the front of the room without a podium or a presentation screen or any of the apparatus of corporate communication, and told them the truth. She told them what had been done to their building, and by whom. She told them about the forged report and the sabotaged electrical system, and the shell companies and the condemnation timeline. She told them about the maintenance approvals she'd signed without understanding what they were enabling. And she did not present this as a performance of accountability. She presented it as a fact. The way Ronan had presented the electrical cabinet photographs to Ellison Webb. "Here is what happened. Here is the evidence. Here is my part in it." The room was not quiet while she spoke. People asked questions in the middle of her sentences. Some were angry. A man in the 3rd row, a father of 4 from the 6th floor, told her with considerable directness that he'd been living with inadequate heat for 2 winters, and that no amount of corporate restructuring reversed those 2 winters for his kids. And he was right, and she said so. "I can't fix what already happened," she said. "I can only fix what happens from here." "What does that mean specifically?" the man said. "It means this building is going into a community ownership structure," she said. "Not owned by Vanguard, not sold to another corporation, held in a resident trust that protects every family in this building from forced displacement. Vanguard funds all necessary repairs, full electrical rewiring of the East Wing, elevator recertification, plumbing, everything on the deferred list, and then the building's operational decisions are made by a resident board, not an executive team in a downtown office. The room processed this. It was not a simple thing to process. Mrs. Dela Cruz, from the 2nd row, said, "And what do you get from that?" "Nothing," Natalie said. "From Westbridge specifically, nothing. The building goes out of Vanguard's direct portfolio. It becomes yours. Then why do it?" Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Because it's the right structure for this situation. And because I've spent 4 years running a property company without understanding what property actually means to the people who live in it." She paused. "I'm trying to understand it now. Martin Osee seated near the back because he'd arrived early enough to choose his position, said in his measured, deliberate way, "The man you mentioned, Beckett. He's been keeping this building running on his own for 4 years." "I know," Natalie said. "What happens to him?" "That's his decision," she said. Ronan was standing at the back of the room near the door. Martin turned to look at him, and then most of the rest of the room turned to look at him, which was the kind of attention he was not built to enjoy. He put his hands in his pockets. "I'm staying," he said. Same apartment, different job. Natalie had offered him the Independent Safety Division directorship in a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes, which was efficient even by her standards. The division would oversee safety and maintenance standards across every residential property. Vanguard managed not as a corporate function reporting to an executive team, but as an independent body whose findings were reported to residents and to the external oversight board simultaneously. It meant Conrad's approach to maintenance reduction could never again be executed without someone whose entire job was to catch it and say so. Ronan had conditions. The division had to have genuine authority, the ability to halt maintenance reductions, flag deferred repairs, and escalate directly to the oversight board without going through company channels first. The director reported to the residents as much as to any executive, and the position was based at Westbridge, not at a corporate headquarters, because he wasn't going to commute 40 minutes each way when his daughter's school was 4 blocks from the building. Natalie agreed to all of it without negotiating, which he found mildly suspicious until she told him she'd already known what his conditions would be before he stated them and had already drafted the terms that way. "How did you know?" he said. "Because you've been doing the job for 4 years without the authority," she said. "I just assumed you'd want the parts that were missing." He started the following Monday. His maintenance duties were absorbed by a new full-time hire who arrived with actual HVAC certification and a much better relationship with soldering equipment than Ronan had ever managed. And Ronan spent his first week in the new role doing what he'd been doing informally for years, walking every residential property in the Vanguard portfolio and writing down what he saw. Not what the maintenance logs said. What he saw with his own eyes, the way an experienced person sees a building, the soft spot in a floor, the paint that covered water damage, the elevator that ran slightly slow on the ascent. He filed his first report on a Friday, and it was 47 pages long, and Natalie read it over the weekend and called him Sunday morning to say that 3 of the properties he'd flagged needed immediate intervention and that she was approving the expenditure without a committee review. "You read the whole thing," he said. "I read everything you send me," she said. "That's part of what I'm trying to do differently." The weeks that followed were not simple. The legal process around Conrad was long and grinding, and occasionally required Ronan or Miles or Natalie to sit in rooms answering the same questions multiple times in slightly different configurations, because that was how legal processes worked, and no one involved had the illusion that it was going to be otherwise. The Westbridge repairs took longer than projected because the electrical contractor ran into secondary issues behind the walls that the original assessment hadn't caught, which was the ordinary way of renovation projects in old buildings. You opened one wall and found 2 more problems behind it. Miles Corwin came back from his sister's house in Renwick after 2 weeks, thinner and considerably more rested than he'd been in the warehouse, and took a position heading an independent ethics office that Natalie established outside the company's existing compliance structure. He bought new glasses, proper ones. Both arms, no tape, and sent Ronan a bottle of reasonably good whiskey with a note that said only, "Thank you for not leaving me there." Ronan put the whiskey on the kitchen shelf and told Sadie it was for adults, and she said she knew that already. The Westbridge Community Trust was formally established 63 days after the board meeting. The signing happened in the building's common room, which had been properly cleaned and furnished by then, with the folding chairs replaced by actual furniture that someone had sourced through a donation program. 14 residents signed on behalf of the trust. Natalie signed on behalf of Vanguard. Ronan witnessed it as director of the Independent Safety Division and also as resident of Apartment 4C, both facts listed on the document. Mrs. Dela Cruz, seated to his right, told him afterward that he should have worn a better shirt. "I was at work," he said. "You could have changed," she said. He didn't have a good answer for that. Courtyard reopening celebration was Sadie's idea, originally. She'd heard adults talking about the building's renovation completion and asked why they didn't have a party. And since nobody had a good answer for why they didn't have a party, Mrs. Dela Cruz organized one with the decisive efficiency she brought to all organizational tasks. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in a month, when the weather had turned genuinely warm, 40-something residents of Westbridge Towers stood in the courtyard under string lights that the electrician had hung the previous week, eating food that people had made and brought and set out on folding tables with no particular coordination, but with the organic abundance of a community that had discovered it was one. The elevator ran reliably now. The east wing had power and heat. Courtyard lights were on a proper timer. Foundation had been assessed. The plumbing had been addressed, and the soft spot near apartment 312 on the third floor had been opened up, properly repaired, and closed again, and it no longer flexed underfoot. Ronan stood near the edge of the courtyard, a cup of something that misses. Dela Cruz had made from a recipe she refused to specify, and watched people in the light. He watched Martin Osi talking to the father from the 6th floor, both of them with drinks in hand, the specific animated quality of a conversation between two people who'd had a shared experience and were still processing it together. He watched the Khatri children running in the space that had been unusable for 2 years. He watched Patricia Elam from 5B, who had worked another 12-hour shift and came to the party anyway, still in her work clothes, eating something from a plate with the focused satisfaction of a person who hadn't sat down in a long time. Natalie appeared at his shoulder with the particular quietness of someone who'd learned to move through the world more carefully than she used to. She'd changed since the board meeting. Not dramatically, she was still the CEO of a property company, still direct, still precise in the way she deployed language and read situations. But she'd started visiting properties before approving decisions rather than after. She'd started asking the questions that took longer to answer, because the answers were people rather than numbers. She was not, Ronan thought, a transformed person. Transformation was too clean a word, too resolved. She was a person who'd seen something she couldn't unsee and was doing the slower, less dramatic work of integrating it. That was harder than transformation. That was real. "How's the party?" she said. "Good," he said. "Mrs. Dela Cruz made something. You should have some before it runs out." "What is it?" "Nobody knows. It's better not to ask." She looked out at the courtyard, at the people in the light, the building behind them, 11 stories against the dark sky with windows lit from inside, ordinary inhabited warmth. "When I was in the garage," she said, "in the dark, with the alarm going, I thought the man coming toward me was one of them." "I know," he said. "I almost ran the other way." "I know that too," he said. "You didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about why not. And I think I was out of directions to run," she said. "And there was something in how you moved that wasn't the same as them. The way you came toward me was different." "How?" She thought about it. "You weren't trying to take something," she said. "You were just trying to get me out." He didn't say anything to that. He looked at the courtyard. Sadie was across the space with 2 other kids from the building, involved in something that appeared to require considerable negotiation and occasional gesturing. At some point during the party, she'd acquired a smear of something orange on her left sleeve, which he'd deal with in the laundry later in the week. "I need to tell you something," Natalie said. He waited. "I've been running Vanguard for 4 years with one version of what I thought leadership meant. The version where you stayed at the level of strategy, where you trusted the people below you to manage the human details, where you measured success in portfolio performance and return on investment." She paused. "I wasn't wrong that those things matter. I was wrong that they're sufficient. You know that now," he said. "I've known it since I sat in your maintenance office on a chair with a bad leg and drank terrible coffee, and you told me the names of the people who lived in this building." She glanced at him. That was the moment. Not the board meeting, not the evidence. That was when I understood what I'd been managing without actually seeing. Ronan turned that over. He thought about how often that was the way it worked. Not the dramatic confrontation, not the documented evidence, not the moment of formal reckoning. The moment a person actually changed was usually smaller and less photogenic than the events surrounding it. A name on a list, a chair with a bad leg, someone saying, "Mrs. Dela Cruz has lived here for 19 years. Martin Osi is 74. Specific, irreducible fact of a human being in a place." "Ronan," Sadie called from across the courtyard. Both adults looked up. She was beckoning with the authoritative impatience of a 9-year-old who had decided that whatever was happening over there was less important than whatever she needed to show someone. "Come look at this." He started to move. Natalie stayed. He walked halfway across the courtyard and then turned back, and she was still standing where he'd left her, watching him with an expression he didn't have a clean name for, and he thought she's going to be somebody's person someday. He thought it with the specific, honest clarity of someone who had not let himself think it before, because there had been too many other things requiring clear thought, and now there was a courtyard and lights and the building standing and people in it, and for the first time in longer than he could specifically identify, the situation did not require him to be at operational readiness. He said, "Come look at whatever Sadie found." Natalie looked at him for a moment. Then she walked across the courtyard and stood beside him. And Sadie showed them both a caterpillar she'd found on one of the newly planted bushes along the courtyard wall, fat and lime green, and moving with the deliberate indifference of a creature entirely unconcerned with property law or board meetings, or the 4-year history of a building's decline and recovery. Sadie narrated several facts about caterpillars that she'd learned at school, some of which were accurate and some of which were plausible inventions, and neither adult corrected the inventions because they were the more interesting ones. After a while, someone put music on from somewhere, low enough not to dominate the space but present, and the party went on around them in the courtyard of a building that was, for the first time in years, actually what it had always technically been, home. There are things that happen in a life that you can trace forward and backward from a single point. Ronan would never claim the moment he pulled Natalie through a maintenance door in a parking garage was destiny or design, because he didn't think in those terms. He thought in terms of what was in front of him and what the right thing to do about it was. Most nights, that was enough of a framework to get through the day. What he would say, if asked, and Sadie did ask, years later, in the specific direct way she had of asking things, was that he'd been a certain kind of person for a long time. Someone who was useful in emergencies and invisible in the spaces between them. Someone who'd gotten so accustomed to keeping his skills and his history separate from his daily life that he'd started to think of them as belonging to different people. Seal and the maintenance worker and the father, all occupying the same body, but rarely the same room. The thing about Westbridge, the thing about Conrad and the flash drive and the basement fire and the 63 families in folding chairs was not that it was a crisis he survived. He'd survived larger crises and come out of them without anything fundamentally shifting. The thing was that for the first time in 4 years, what he was good at and what he cared about were exactly the same thing. There was no separation. The skills weren't somewhere in storage while his real life happened around them. They were in the room. They were for this. That was the part he hadn't expected. Not Natalie, not the job, not the community trust or the courtyard lights or any of the specific outcomes. Just the feeling of being entirely present in his own life, all of it at once, nothing held back or stored away for a context that would never come. As for Natalie, she would not say she was a different person than she'd been before the parking garage. She was the same person with the same abilities and the same flaws and the same tendency to work through a legal pad in 2 hours when other people took 2 days. What was different was the size of the frame she put around the work. Numbers described buildings. She'd always known how to read numbers. What she was still learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with frequent revision, was to read the people those numbers were supposed to serve. She was not finished learning it. She didn't expect to be finished. Somewhere along the way, not at a specific moment, not in a dramatic scene, either of them could have pointed to it and said that was it. She and Ronan stopped pretending that what existed between them was purely professional, and they were both private enough about it that nobody in the building knew before Sadie did. And nobody knew after Sadie did until Sadie decided to tell Mrs. Delacruz, which meant everyone in the building knew within 48 hours. Mrs. Delacruz, for what it was worth, said she'd known since the day Natalie sat in the maintenance office on the chair with the bad leg. Ronan asked her how she could possibly have known that. Because she drank the coffee, Mrs. Delacruz said, "That machine makes terrible coffee. You have to care about something in that room to drink it." He didn't have a good answer for that either. The courtyard at Westbridge Towers, on the night of the reopening celebration, stayed lit until almost midnight. People drifted inside gradually, the way people left good parties reluctantly, with the awareness that the night was over, but what had made it good was not. The lights stayed on after the last person went inside, because that was how the new timer was set, and they illuminated an empty courtyard and the front of a building that had been worth fighting for. Not because of its square footage or its assessed value or its position in a portfolio, because of what it was to the people inside it. That's a harder case to make in a spreadsheet. It's the only case worth making.